for anybody that's not been to an office hours before or any of the boot camps, I am Lewis Pope. I'm the head security nerd at Enable. Um, I've been in the MSP space for probably 12 or 14 years at this point. Started out with just break fix PC repair. Then I was with an MSP that I helped build up from break fix to the MSP model for over about 6 years. I've been here with Enable for about the past 4. Previous role was as a sales engineer. So I have spent a lot of time with the products in production in the field. So you'll hear me talk a lot about technical implementations and stuff a lot more often than you will about the high end, fluffy concepts of, well, you really should do something. I'll often get down into the, well, this is how you do something. If you have any questions during the session today, use the questions section. That's what I've got up and what I'm monitoring. So if you have any questions, any problems, put those in there. Everybody is going to be on mute since we do have a larger, we're going to have a larger amount of attendance today than usual, it looks like. So remember, put any questions in the questions. If you put it in the chat, I probably won't see it. Also, there is the handout section that is right beneath the poll. So in the GoToWebinar dashboard, there will be a little handout section where you can download the security office hours handout. That will be a PDF that has a bunch of additional links and references and resources from things I may be talking about today. So I'll have a table that breaks down my prioritization for vulnerabilities based on not only severity, but also temporal severity, and also a bunch of links to additional resources from us internally at Enable, as well as some external resources, as well as some links to some cybersecurity tools and some other things that I'll be talking about today. So make sure you grab that for yourself. Even if you've picked up one from the previous sessions, this one has new content in it. So for anybody that's not been to an office hours before for security, just a quick, well, what is this? It's a monthly session that's focused on security. We'll review the recent Microsoft Patch Tuesday release and any significant out-of-band updates that came out from Microsoft in the previous month. Also go if there's any known issues or anything you should be aware of for those patches and security updates. Cover any significant recent security news, or maybe just a couple of news articles that you might be able to use for your own content generation. Any new and upcoming things for us and the security features or products we have. Also cookbook items. So if you have not been exposed to the cookbook, you'll get your first exposure to the cookbook today, which is where we keep a bunch of pre-made monitors, scripts, tasks, 24/7 checks for RMM and in Central. And we'll also have plenty of time for Q&A today. And this is all with the goal of just making your operations more secure and efficient to get you up to the next level from wherever you currently are. All right, so first we're just going to start out with security news, since that's where we start out with for each session. And again, the news we've got for this month is a little bit, well, it's one of those good news, bad news things. Good news in the sense that we're going to tell you about something you should be knowledgeable about, but bad news in the sense that, well, it's a new problem that we have to deal with. So there's a new ransomware non-negotiation tactic that some of the ransomware gangs are starting to pick up. So they're upping the pressure, and one of these things is one of the reasons why they're upping the pressure in the way that they are is because, well, they are getting a lot more attention than what they used to. They're specifically the Grief and Ragnar Locker ransomware gangs are now threatening to immediately delete decryption keys or release data if a third-party negotiator or law enforcement are involved in the situation. So they're basically reaching out to the victims and saying, if you talk about this, if you bring in anybody else about it, if you do anything other than just pay us the ransom, we're just going to delete the keys, release your data. And the reason why is because a lot of these gangs have had to, go low, rebrand themselves, and come back again in order to, oddly enough, avoid U.S. sanctions, because their payment routes and a bunch of their other their operations were interrupted by U.S. sanctions that were put out there. So they don't want to get those U.S. sanctions placed on them again very quickly. So they're basically telling their victims, hush, hush, don't talk about this because we don't want the attention. So they're threatening them by saying deletion of encryption keys or releasing of data to keep victims quiet so it doesn't draw as much attention. So this is going to be something that's going to change it's going to change the conversation a little bit for anybody that has clients that get hit by ransomware, and this comes up. You're going to have to then deal with the situation with the client, where the client's going to say, "Well, what do we do? Do we involve third parties? Do we?" Um, it all depends. How valuable is the data? Can it be restored? What's the risk assessment of it? You'll still going to want to report the incident, but you can do all kinds of things on the back end and not tell the ransomware gang exactly what you're doing on the back end. There's also been the Miraspotnet, which has been responsible for two of the largest DDoS attacks this year. Some of the code is derived from the Mirai botnet that was the top of the king of the hill for this kind of stuff for a very long time. Right now, the majority of the devices that are affected by this are MikroTik routers. So if you're using those, um, you should secure them. You should need to check out, make sure they've not been compromised, get them on the new firmware updates. MikroTik has also released information on how to secure those. I have the link for that in the handout. So if you're using them as a vendor for routers, I've already got the link in there, and you can go find their remediation information. These are the two things that are kind of current in the news. Things that this one for the MikroTik routers. If you've got those, you needed to know about it because you've got work to do. The other for the ransomware, you just need to be aware of how the ransomware gangs are changing their tactics, how their messaging is changing. So if this happens to you or a client, you're not completely blindsided by it. And also, it gives you an opportunity to create some content, to go have some conversations, and to let your clients know that if they are being a little hard-headed or resistant to uh, adding additional layers of security or hardening their endpoints, or taking your recommendations on why it's a really bad idea to still be using SMB1 in their environments, this is just something else you can use to have as ammo in that conversation about why you need to move away from whatever it is that's making their environment, making the risk exposure unacceptable for you. So for patches this month in Patch Tuesday, so we've got 60 total vulnerabilities that were addressed. It was 86 in total if you count the ones that were fixed for Microsoft Edge, the new Microsoft Edge browser. 3 of those 60 are rated as critical. 1 is under active exploitation, and that one that's under the active exploitation is actually the MS-HTML ActiveX exploit that's been leveraged here over the past week or so. Just as what is that one? That's the anybody that remembers ActiveX from back in the day. Microsoft Office still supports ActiveX, and it's taking advantage of vulnerabilities in the HTML component that's handling HTML rendering inside of Office products. But basically, it's just another way for somebody to receive a booby-trapped booby-trapped Word document, open it, and have their machine infected. So that's the current, active exploited item that really needs to be addressed at the moment. This is lower than last. It's not lower than last month as far as total count of vulnerabilities, but it is a significant drop in what we saw in the first half of the year when we were getting hundreds of, 120 vulnerabilities patched a month. So to put some perspective on this is something I always like to cover. And this is why patch management is needed at scale. So there were only 60 vulnerabilities that were addressed by Microsoft this month. Okay, great. But whenever you sit down and you try to pair up the individual patches to the individual OSs the OS builds, the individual versions of software that need a specific patch. When you go through all the permutations of that, it ends up being 1,248 different combinations this month. So that is a big number. Thankfully, because of things like WSUS, Windows Update, patch management inside of RMM or in Central, it makes it fairly trivial for us to be able to keep up with this, make sure patches are being detected on systems, right ones are being applied, they're not being missed. But because it is fairly easy and transparent, and it just kind of happens for us at this point once we set up our rules and how we want it to behave, sometimes you lose perspective on the fact of exactly how much is going on under the hood to make this happen. And it's worth calling this out. So whenever you are in negotiations or you are trying to explain to clients or prospects why it is important to have somebody handle patching systems for you, handle the management of it, to make sure it's being done and to validate it. This is why. Tell them, well, there's, just last month there was 1,248 different patches that could possibly have been applied to your systems. We go through the trouble of figuring out which ones go where and making sure that it's done. That sounds a lot more impressive whenever you start discussing it in that sense, rather than just, oh, we have a patch management engine that does it for us. Pull back the curtain a little bit and show that complexity that has now been trivialized by the tools that you're using. Then there is the prioritization. So whenever you're prioritizing which vulnerabilities you should be dealing with first, which means which patches are you going to be focusing on, making sure they're out and deployed. I have, and again, this is also in the handout, I always take and sort them out by critical vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities that are marked as exploitation more likely or exploitation detected. And the reason why is because if you have a critical vulnerability that is exploitation less likely, well, it's a critical vulnerability. It means if it's taken advantage of, it could be bad, worse than others, but it's not likely to be done versus these others that are only important severity, but they're marked as exploitation more likely or even exploitation detected. So whenever you think of it in a sense of time frames of which one should go first and which one in what order, your exploitation detected should have the highest priority. It's under active exploitation and needs to be patched. And then your exploitation more likely vulnerabilities should probably be just as important to get patched against as your critical vulnerability patches. And that's just on the sense of a time frame. If something's more likely to be abused or it is actively being abused, you're much more likely to see repercussions from having that vulnerability in your environment in a week than you are a critical one that's marked as exploitation less likely. That's the reason why I go through the trouble of building out this as a list. This also, again, it's in the handout. So if you want a little bit of, well, what direction should I go? Which patch should I focus on first? This is a good way of doing it. Cumulative updates for the month. And before I leave this, again, the exploitation detected, that's that MS HTML vulnerability. And then there's also here some Windows print spooler elevation uh, and the remote code execution vulnerabilities that were getting patched. This one in particular is the one from May, but it's been updated, and this should be the final nail in the coffin for the print nightmare vulnerabilities. At this point, according to Microsoft, as well as a lot of third-party security researchers, they finally have plugged all of the vulnerabilities associated with the print nightmare situation. So that will be a little bit of stress off of everybody. We won't have to worry about workarounds and mitigation so much anymore. We can, just make sure the systems are up to date. For cumulative updates, so we have just regular roll up of security updates, but we also have two rather important bug fixes. We've got a bug fix for Bluetooth headsets. So there was a bug where certain Bluetooth headsets would only get audio. Um, you'll only get audio for voice calls. And then there's the bug fix for external monitors that stay black after hibernation. So that's it's one of those aggravating things that doesn't show up very often, but when it does, this is just one more headache you don't have to deal with now with this cumulative set of cumulative updates. Also, just as a looking towards the future, Windows 10 2004 hits end of service December 14th this year. So we had 19 previous builds fall off earlier this year. Now they're slated to take 2004 to end of service again in December. So if you are not already planning for transitions and making sure that everybody is on the a more current build of Windows, now's the time to start planning for that. Making sure that you've got proper inventory and asset information available so you can go out there and find out, make sure machines are on the right versions, and what are you going to do about updating it needs to already be planned out at this point. Because at this point, whenever it hits end of service, then Microsoft's going to stop providing security fixes for this version, unless, of course, it's one of those major security fixes that they have to push out to everybody. For reported patch issues. So as of first thing early yesterday, wasn't a lot of chatter going um, on the Patch Tuesday mega thread, which if you don't know what this is, it is a great place to go out and pretty much hear almost immediately if there are widespread problems being reported by anybody. By this morning, there was a little bit more chatter coming up about the print nightmare causing patch, the print nightmare vulnerability patches causing complications with printers. Um, so far, the reasoning that I have seen is that if you have applied any type of permission changes or other Microsoft recommended remediations or mitigations, that's not what's causing the problems. It's something else that's causing it. But nobody I've seen so far has pinned down exactly what it is. So for those print spool and the remote code execution vulnerabilities that are being patched with the security updates this month, this is one of those. Do we just hold off the cumulative update that's going to include that? Do we kind of hold off on those? Do we pick and choose specific security updates? And are we going to, do everything but those? Or are we going to wait for those for a week or so? It's always that risk analysis you have to make. But this is one of the reasons why you have production versus test environments. Test it out in your test environment first, or on your test machines first. Make sure nothing breaks. Nothing breaks, push it to production. But at the moment, that's pretty much the only major thing I've seen reported. Um, Again, if you want this link, it's in the handout, so you'll be able to follow that Reddit thread, and they always update it every month for the current Patch Tuesday. So on to some security tools. This is a new section I'm going to be adding in to the conversation each month because, well, a lot of what we do as security for cybersecurity, it's equal parts process and equal parts tools. The process side of things is, choosing security frameworks, building to those security frameworks, doing documentation, building your incident response plans, having, your hierarchy of who's called for what situation, all of that kind of boring organizational and documentation stuff you have to do for security. And then there's the tools. These are the things, the individual tool to solve an individual problem or task type deal. And for first, I'm just going to talk about Kali Linux since they just did release a new build of Kali Linux. So for anybody's not familiar with Kali, it's a pen testing platform distro basically. It's a Linux distribution that's used widely by pen testers and other security researchers. And it is used by professionals in production, and they are selling their services with this. It comes packaged with a ton of open source tools. It will take a while to master, but you can get started using it in minutes. And if you have ever had to have a partner or a prospect ask you about pen testing, or if you've ever wondered how to do pen testing, and you don't want to go out and engage an MSSP or a pen tester or another professional to do it for you, you want to learn to do it yourself, learning Kali Linux is probably going to be the first step. So it's a good place to start. And there's also tons of documentations and tutorials freely available everywhere on the internet. So Kali Linux is something that if you are self-guided, whenever it comes to learning and you're very motivated, you can be pen testing with Linux against Kali against your clients in like a week and a half. So if that is a direction you've wanted to go and you've wanted to keep it internal and maximize margins, Kali Linux is a great place to start. Then another new tool. This is something that was I just found out about 2 weeks ago. Used it a few times. I'm really liking it. It's Chainsaw. It is an open source tool. It is meant to be a Windows event log analyzer. So it will run through your Windows event log for you using built-in detection. It also has the ability to import additional rules and threat hunting rules. But it is meant for situations where you have something happen in an environment and then you have to go figure out what happened to that endpoint, but you didn't have a SIM or a SOC solution set up or an EDR solution set up. Maybe you only had regular AV on the system. Well, a downside of having regular AV on a system is it can tell you that it killed and quarantined and stopped a generic virus name on this date at this time in this location, but that's all it tells you. It doesn't tell you anything else about what happened, what file changes were made, what system registry or system changes or registry changes were made. You need a tool like a SIM or a EDR solution in place to know those types of things. If one of those aren't in place, then, well, the only thing you really have available to you to figure out what happened is to look through event logs. This is a tool that makes that a much more pleasant experience. Um, this is another one of those tools of, it's an open source tool. You have to learn it. Nobody's going to really troubleshoot or offer you support for it. But once you figure out how to use it, this is a very valuable tool. And if anybody has ever, and most of us probably have been in this situation where something happens to an endpoint, we are brought in to investigate it and fix it. And without the knowledge that comes from a SIM or a SOC or an EDR solution, you really don't know what happened to the machine. And you have to sometimes just guess and then throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. So run a repair tool, clean up utility system, restore, whatever it is to try and sort things out. This can give you more information so you're not flying completely in the dark. The next is on to the cookbook. And again, if this is something that you have not had the experience to had the pleasure of enjoying yet, the cookbook. Let me get this out here. And again, this should be in the handout. Uh, and I'm also going to grab that mega thread link in case somebody said I don't have it in the handouts. So I'm just going to grab that link and I'm going to throw it, copy, and answer. There we go. It'll be send to all. There we go. We got the, in case I did miss it and I didn't include the link in the handout, the link I just posted in the questions section as an answer is the link for the Patch Tuesday mega thread. But the cookbook is a collection of scripts and tasks that the sales engineers, the head nerds, our partners have thrown together to solve specific problems, specific situations, specific issues that aren't part of like a default option within inside of RMM or in Central. So the four ones that I want to point out is one, we've got the CVE 2021-40444 mitigation. That is that MS HTML vulnerability that's underneath active exploitation. We posted, actually, I posted that about a week ago whenever Microsoft first released the mitigation information. So that just is going in and changing some registry entries to block ActiveX inside of Microsoft Office. So if you can't apply patches for some reason, you can't apply this vulnerability fix. You are on we don't patch on the beginning of the month. We wait until the end of the month to apply patches. I would still probably apply this individual patches for this individual vulnerability anyway. But if you can't for whatever reason, we've got a mitigation available for you. We also have the Kaseya endpoint detection tool, and this was one of those popular requests that we got from a few partners that wanted to be able to make sure that they didn't have Kaseya agents hanging around on their endpoints anymore. But that also started up a conversation, and we also created that last one, which is a competitor RMM monitoring script. And what that one does is it just takes as input the names of different software that you want to monitor for. And this allows you to monitor for other remote access tools or RMM tools. If you are using, if you're using our RMM and you use our take control solution, then there probably should not be instances of Screen Connect or AnyDesk or Atera or any other types of tools on your systems. And if one of those kinds of software does show up, well, there's only so many reasons why it's going to show up. One, your partner has engaged with a third party for MSP type services, and you need to know about that immediately because it might be an early indicator of churn. An end user may have been, social engineered. They allowed somebody to, install something on their machine, or you've got an attacker that's gained, a foothold in the environment, and they're trying to set up themselves some additional persistence. If you saw I can't even remember the name of the ransomware gang, but there was an affiliate for a ransomware gang that released their entire playbook last month, and part of their documentation in there was the whole process of how do you set up persistence in the environment by using tools like Atera or AnyDesk, or the whole thing is that you can use any. Yep, it was the Conti group. There is nothing to stop an attacker from using legitimate software that an AV solution may not block. So you've got to add the additional monitoring yourself to make sure those types of tools aren't showing up in your environments. And that this one in the cookbook is a great one for that. And then there's also just a lock screen after 10 minutes of inactivity. This was another one of those specific requests from a partner about we just need to be able to do this one thing. Okay, sure. And they couldn't rely on group policy because, well, they got a bunch of work from home is still happening for them. So, and they can't trust people to log in to VPN to get the group policy updates and all that kind of stuff. So we gave them a way to be able to do it through just the N-Central agent. All right, next thing. Actually, before I get into that, any idea on the better security? So there was a question that came in about the 8 Linux agents. So they are actively, if you haven't been keeping too close of an eye on it, the RMM agents have received some significant security updates for Linux agents. They've also, if you haven't noticed, we also have an ARM distribution now available. It's labeled as a Raspberry Pi agent. Um, you can, of course, use that on other ARM devices if you want to. Of course, mileage is going to vary because we didn't test for anything else, but those are available now. On the N-Central side, they're also going to be receiving some of those in Linux improvements here soon as well. It is not going to be a paradigm shift of anything, of giant, huge new features that kind of give us a whole new set of features, but it is getting some work. Sure, this left my name. That's a good question. So, whenever it comes to adding exclusions to AV products, so let me grab up another window here too. So, whenever you have a traditional AV solution, and somebody says, like a software vendor says, "Hey, we need you to add these exclusions for our software because X, Y, Z." Even we have that. If you go check on the in our documentation for RMM for Incentral, there is guidance in there about the exclusions you should add for the product. Well, first thing whenever it comes to exclusions is you never add exclusions unless you have to. So even if a vendor says we want you to add these exclusions, sometimes you don't need to. They put that in there as just a, you know what, we know this causes problems sometimes, therefore we're going to advise out the gate that you shouldn't put these exclusions, or that you should put these exclusions. And there's always the risk assessment there. Do I do it? Do I not do it? Do I try it and see what happens? But with traditional AV, once you put those exclusions in, then it say, well, you've told the AV to ignore what's happening there. So, just as an example, if you are using our RMM solution and somehow or another somebody, we'll go with the somebody compromised and gained access to your dashboard and they used it to try and push out ransomware. Well, if you've got the exclusion on our folders, well, it can start doing that, and then the AV is going to, it's got an exclusion that's not going to pay attention to it. But if you have something like EDR in place, well, it doesn't care about the exclusion in the same way that a traditional AV does. A traditional AV says, ignore what's happening here. With EDR, and I'm trying to get an instance of this up so I can show it for anybody that's not seen it before. Um, Next gen AV solutions do not use standard exclusions anymore. That is a relic of the past. Newer solutions are using exclusions of varying degrees. And it starts out with um, basically a do not alert for things that happen here, all the way to the other end of the exclusion that says uh, don't bother what's monitoring here, what's happening here, which is telling it that behave like more of a traditional AV's exclusion. But with like our EDR solution, there's actually 5 levels of exclusion, and they're called interoperability. And those are what you're going to choose for those situations. You're going to tell EDR, look, you're still going to monitor this location. You're still going to be checking out what's happening here, but maybe you just back off a little bit so you don't impede the software's operation. A great example of this is something like SolidWorks or Sage. Anything that is from any software, any application that's got anti-tamper features baked into it or anti-piracy measures baked into it. They are not going to take kindly to certain AVs monitoring them, and you have to add exclusions. Same thing with our EDR solution, but with our EDR, that's still not all you've got the ability of telling EDR to back off a little bit and not do the, for instance, the first level of exclusion you can add for interoperability is telling it don't do the driver injection on the processes. And that's usually what causes the application to not run on a system with the AV present. So you're able to tell it, look, back off just a little bit, not all the way. And it is part of that giant, larger risk assessment of a particular environment for particular reasons, for particular software, for particular security stance. It has to be, judged on each individual instance on whether it's allowable or not, if it's a good idea or not. But in the end, exclusions are never going to go away, because the only way for exclusions to go away would be for every software vendor in the world to get together and define specifics about how everything is going to operate. And they try to do that. There is a lot of common things in there, but every software vendor is not going to sit there and make sure that their software works correctly with every other person's software. It's just unfeasible. So exclusions are never going to go anywhere. They are the nature of the beast. And the only thing you can really do is make the evaluation per instance, and also think about transitioning to a solution that does not use blanket exclusions, because blanket exclusions are blanket exclusions. It's saying don't bother monitoring anything here. Anything that happens here can happen here. um, and that's also another, and as a uh, as a hypothetical, not really a hypothetical, but it's probably another question that's rolling around in some people's mind here is, well, what would happen if, for whatever reason, my dashboard was compromised, somebody gains access to it and starts trying to do malicious things. Well, it's kind of like the same thing as, well, what if somebody gets the admin credentials for a domain? Well, if they get admin credentials for a domain, they can do whatever they want to those endpoints. Same thing with RMM or Essential. If somebody gains access to your RMM or Essential, they got the keys to the kingdom. That's why it's so important that you have multi-factor authentication set up and such, and in RMM using the IP-based restrictions, things like that. Attempt to quarantine security software processes. Yeah. And it's another something else that somebody, and you're just throwing in here about exceptions for things is, yeah, it's you're going to have everybody out there is going to tell you, um, we want you to put in these exclusions so our product works correctly, and then you can bother another software vendor for problems that pop up. And yeah, they sometimes a software vendor may be telling you something that's probably not in your best interest when it comes to securing the environment, but it's to ensure that their software works the way it's supposed to. And that's always, it's always a case by case, software by software. Is the risk worth it kind of situation. Um, but back to the whole, if an environment's compromised thing, that's why, if you're really, really serious about it, that's why having something like an endpoint protection platform like EDR or something similar that has anti-tamper features in it. That way, even if somebody gets into a system, they can't just uninstall EDR. So if an attacker hits an endpoint, EDR can't be uninstalled locally. It requires the dashboard access or a security phrase that's unique to each agent, and they can't just force uninstall it. And that's one of the things that an attacker is going to do. The first thing they will do once they gain access to an environment is they will try to turn off logging, and they will try to turn off whatever security features that are available on that endpoint. Regular AV, most of the time you can. The other times is that, even after they can't uninstall it. They might try to snooze it. They may try to stop it. They will do whatever they can to interrupt its operation. EDR and the more advanced solutions cannot be treated that way. So it can do a lot to stop more advanced attacks that are more than just somebody clicking on a bad email. Because if somebody clicks on an email that has a link to a file that has a payload in it, well, a lot of AVs are going to catch that. Not many regular normal AVs, though, are going to catch the phallus attacks that are secondary malware payloads that come off of somebody going off to the dark web somewhere, buying a $7 RDP credential. And yes, you can go to the dark web and buy a validated working set of RDP credentials for $7, and then go hit it and then start dropping ransomware. You know, standard AVs aren't going to protect you from that. You need, more, you need to start having, that's more processes and perimeters and controls, and having firewall setting up and only allowing RDP connections over VPN versus having RDP exposed out to the internet, having multi-factor authentication on the VPN. All those kinds of things go into the whole layer security in depth, layered security, keeping threats as far out to the perimeter as possible, because that's most of the time always your first goal, is to keep threats as far away from end users and your data as possible. And anything you can do to do that benefits you. There's not one solution, there's not one surefire way of approaching all of this. You know, you can have the most expensive security tool there is and use it poorly, or you can have, not spend $1 and do everything by hand with open source tools, and you can still wind up with a more secure environment. It's all about, skills, knowledge, experience, and more so than anything else. All right, I don't think I've got any open questions here still. Yeah, well, yeah, somebody dropped a list of exclusions that a software, an application was asking for. And it can be kind of an intimidating and a long exclusion list, especially whenever a piece of software starts telling you that you should have, Windows subsystem folders as part of exclusions. That gets a little hairy for me. I don't like that idea. But if I had to, well, you have to. And then I would be implementing SFC scans as part of my new regimen for that environment, because I need to make sure that those Windows subsystem files are in good shape. So let me run SFC scan now on a weekly schedule to make sure those aren't being tampered with. So it may not have been something I had done originally in that environment for security purposes, but once I've got a solution that tells me not to, oh yeah, I would definitely be adding SFC to my regular routines. Or if I'm in virtualized, making sure that those are not, those are transient VMs, and they're being brought down and brought back up as brand new, fresh from known good states. Those types of things. Oh yeah, and also in the handout, I do have the tools that I've discussed here. I've got the other, the list of prioritization for vulnerabilities. But somebody else did point out that I did include anti-siphon for the cybersecurity training. They were doing the Wild West Hackfest recently. They are running a pay what you can for some of their training right now, and I went through their SOC core skills training last week. It was a great refresher for me. I learned a few new skills in there. So even if you're, actually probably even more so if you're a veteran MSP, you've been at this for a while, uh, you know, continuing education exists for a reason. And this is a great inexpensive way to drop in to some sessions ran by some people that actually know what they're doing. They're not reading from scripts. It is, live sessions, live training, and you can ask questions, interact with them. They have a wonderful Discord running for this stuff. And if you want to up your skill set, this is a great way to start. Is to leverage that anti-siphon training. And again, they're running some pay what you can right now, but if you pay enough, they'll also give you access to their cyber range, which is it's more training, but it's an environment for you to leverage to kind of self guide at that point.